Hello and welcome to our Freed Indeed book club. Right now, we're going through the book The Case for a Creator. Sorry, this is actually our Freed Indeed book class. Um, and so, right now, we're going through Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. I really love this book. This is my favorite book that I like to go through. My well, it's one of my favorite books. Lee Strobel has a whole series of books that I really love to go through with people, with counselees who are struggling with faith, counselees who are struggling with the sort of challenges to the gospel and challenges to the historicity of Christianity and these sorts of things. So I like to go through these books, and this book is my favorite starting point because this book shows, I think it does a really good job of demonstrating why we shouldn't trust the kind of narrative that we've all been fed, and why we should instead trust the truth that God has revealed to us in scripture and in the church. Now, before I continue with the book club, though, I do want to read some feedback that we got here. It says, I'm only halfway through the series, so maybe you are first I want to go up here a little bit. Um, this series is so much needed. I don't know of such an up-to-date resource I can send people when they ask about evolution. I was raised with some creationist beliefs, but this series is way better. So I really appreciate that feedback. I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah, these kinds of resources are really beneficial, and I'm so glad to be able to be presenting it. Now, I did get a question. I'm only halfway through the series, so maybe you or Lee Strobel mentioned this, but I think the key thing that sums everything up is correlation does not equal causation. When people say their correlations prove something, that is even worse than saying it implies causation. And then on top of that, the correlations are often fraudulent. So there's three layers of violation of basic scientific principles. Again, that's a really awesome point. I'm glad to be getting that feedback. I'm glad that this series has been a blessing to you, and you're absolutely spot on. Correlation doesn't equal causation, and sometimes we can jump that bridge and say that something has been proven when in reality, at best, we can see a correlation. And then additionally, as we've already shown in this series, causation very often, or I should say correlation very often is not even actually present, or at least not as strong as previously um, implied. So let's move forward here. Last time we got together, it was actually 2 weeks ago. We talked about the Kalam cosmological argument. We worked through the Kalam argument. We established it. We saw that the Big Bang has really demonstrated that the universe did in fact have a beginning, and we've seen how this strengthened the argument. So now it's been a couple of weeks, and the reason it's been a couple of weeks is because, to be honest, I was actually injured, and did not um I was not able to put together a video because I was in a lot of pain. Um I know that I have had an unprecedented amount of injuries and things this year, but we press on, right? We move forward, we do things, um, and that's just how it kind of has to be. And I also do have to say, I am working full time as a biblical counselor. I am constantly working to um, maintain a full time schedule with biblical counseling, and the YouTube channel does not bring in a lot of money. So, in order to, if you want to see us make videos more consistently and more regularly, then thank you, Cheryl. Then the best way to do that is to support the channel. With that said, let's get into today's topic, which is alternatives to the Big Bang. And we're going to see that some of these alternatives include Carl Sagan's recycled universes and Stephen Hawking's imagination. Not Stephen Hawking's imagination that led him to Epstein's Island. Fortunately, we don't have to talk about that. But let's get right into our topic. And by the way, I'm sorry if my voice sounds a little off today. I actually have I'm a little bit stuffed up and I didn't sleep very well last night. I woke up in the middle of the night and I couldn't sleep, so I just got up and worked on writing for a few hours. So I've had a really good start to my day, but I'm also tired. So let's get into it here, starting on page 137. So remember, today what we're going to be looking at is we've seen the Big Bang, we've seen how the Big Bang helps with the case for a creator. Now we want to examine, okay, if the Big Bang is so good for our case as Christians, then is the Big Bang actually true? There are other theories out there. Let's see if those theories are as strong or stronger than the Big Bang. So, efforts to come up with alternatives to the standard Big Bang model have intensified in recent years. Many scientists are troubled by the fact that the beginning of the universe necessitates a creator. Others are perturbed because the laws of physics cannot create for the creation event. Einstein admitted the idea of the expanding universe irritates me, end quote. Presumably, said one prominent scientist, because of its theological implications. British astronomer Arthur Eddington called the Big Bang Theory repugnant. MIT's Philip Morrison said, I would like to reject it. Jastrow said that it was distasteful to the scientific mind, adding, there is a kind of religion in science. It is the religion of a person who believes that there is order and harmony in the universe. Every event can be explained in a rational way. We've talked a lot about my issue with talking that way and how I reject the idea that science is the only rational means of examination, or that supernatural explanations are inherently irrational. I reject both of those premises. But we go on. As the product of some previous event, every effect must have its cause. There is no first cause. This religious faith of the scientist is violated by the discovery that the world had a beginning, under conditions in which the known laws of physics are not valid as products of forces or circumstances we cannot discover. When that happens, the scientist has lost control. He examines the implications. He would be traumatized. So I just want to note a few things. One is that he calls science, he says there's a religion in the scientific community. He describes this religious sort of fervor to try to avoid theological implications. So when people say that atheism isn't a religion, they are frankly lying to themselves. Atheism is most definitely a religion. And The difference between atheism and, say, Christianity is that Christianity is a religion that's willing to examine all of the evidence and challenge itself, as we've been doing in this series, and come to conclusions that take into account all of the data. Atheism is only willing to, the very fact that people have to talk about quote unquote rational explanations instead of taking into account all of the evidence, and the very fact that people have to avoid evidence they don't like, shows that atheism is a religion that frankly cannot withstand scrutiny. But this shows that the Big Bang Theory makes people uncomfortable. So, what are some alternatives? The first alternative that we examine is something called the steady state theory, which was proposed in 1948. The steady state theory says that the universe was expanding, but claimed that galaxies retreat from each other and new matter merely comes into existence out of nothing to fill the void. So, in other words, the universe is always in this steady state of expansion, and there's this constant sort of popping into existence out of nothing of random, I guess, space objects, which would be pretty intense. If this theory were actually true, then I feel like it would be very difficult. I don't understand how this theory would actually help the atheist's case. This seems like the sort of thing that would 100% not help the atheist's case. But this was the steady state theory. The problem with the steady state theory is that it is based on no evidence whatsoever. It assumes that galaxies come into existence out of nothing, which is something that we have never seen happen. It's something that does not appear to happen. And the person who came up with the steady state theory literally admitted that he was coming up with this theory simply because he didn't like the Big Bang or its theological implications. So this takes us back to that idea of religion in science, right? Like, the fact that somebody was literally coming up with a whole scientific theory that he had no evidence to support just so that he wouldn't have to accept the Big Bang shows what a religious mindset he had with regards to this. But the steady state theory is, for the most part, dead in the water. There's not really anybody today that holds to the steady state theory. So let's examine some theories that we do encounter in the world of science, sometimes to this very day, starting with Sagan's recycled universes. So basically, what Sagan says is that the universe goes through a perpetual cycle of expanding and contracting. So there hasn't been per se one big bang. It's more like the universe expands and then contracts back together and then expands again, and this is an endless cycle. And this is how Carl Sagan accounts for the universe, and he asserts that this somehow makes the universe eternal, because if the universe because the universe never had a beginning per se, it's had many beginnings and endings. So basically, it's the recycle symbol rebranded as science. This is also called the oscillating model. Um, it's a model in it's the oscillating model because it's a model in which the universe expands and then contracts. This was popular in the 1960s, as was free love and its resulting STDs. It was also popular among the Soviet Union. And the reason why it was popular in the 1960s is because so many people contracted syphilis and lost their minds. I'm just kidding. That's not why. It was popular in the 1960s. It was also very popular in the Soviet Union because Soviet scientists recognized that Marxism was rooted in philosophical materialism, and philosophical materialism cannot work if the universe had a beginning. So that's why it was popular back then. Um, that model was popular in the 1960s. In 1968, when I was at the World Congress on philosophy in Dusseldorf, I heard Soviet bloc cosmologists espousing this model simply because of their commitment to dialectical materialism. They could not deny the eternality of matter because this was part of the Marxist philosophy, and so despite the evidence, they were holding out hope for the oscillating model. Now, notice this though, I do want to note something that Soviet scientists were at least honest enough to admit that the evidence wasn't really on their side, and they were holding out hope for this. Whereas people like Carl Sagan like to present it as if the evidence was on their side. But the Soviet scientists were at least honest and said, "Yeah, this theory isn't super strong yet, but we're getting there." So I will give credit where credit is due, but the 60s were a wild time, wild and crazy. However, this theory isn't just from the 60s, okay? There's still people who hold to the oscillating model in some form or other. For example, Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything mentions this theory and says that if this theory is true, then the universe is merely one of an eternal cycle of expanding and contracting universes and is not, therefore, the product of any particular creation event. So you can see that the recycled universe is a theory that still to this day enjoys um, actually, I mean, quite a bit of popularity in a lot of ways. It's not as popular as it was in the 60s, but it's not gone by any means. However, I think it's really fitting that this theories is named after, recycling because the theory is pretty much garbage. So on page 140, we read the following. Well, there are several problems with the oscillating model that have been known for decades. For one thing, it contradicts the known laws of physics. Theorems by Hawking and Penrose show that as long as the universe is governed by general relativity, the existence of an initial singularity or beginning is inevitable, and that it's impossible to pass through the singularity to a subsequent state. And there's no known physics that could reverse the contracting universe, or could reverse a contracting universe and then suddenly make it bounce before it hits the singularity. The whole theory was simply a theoretical abstraction. Physics never supported it. Another problem is that in order for the universe to oscillate, it has to contract at some point. For this to happen, the universe would have to be dense enough to generate sufficient gravity that would eventually slow its expansion to a halt and then, with increasing rapidity, contract it into a big crunch. But estimates have consistently indicated that the universe is far below the density needed to contract, even when you include not only its luminous matter, but also its invisible dark matter. Recent tests run by 5 different laboratories in 1998 calculated 95% certainty that the universe will not contract, but that it will expand forever. In fact, in a completely unexpected development, the studies indicated that the expansion is not decelerating, but may actually be accelerating. This really puts the final nail in the coffin of the oscillating model. So, this model is totally unscientific. The the idea of a contracting universe simply doesn't happen. The universe is expanding. The universe always has been expanding, And even if it did somehow contract, there's no way that it would bounce back. So, this idea that the universe is in a perpetual cycle of expanding and contracting honestly just makes no sense at all from a scientific standpoint. But there's another problem. And that problem is that this really just pushes the problem back a step. We've talked about this before with some of the other theories we've examined. Um, so in this particular theory, mathematicians concluded that and scientists concluded that entropy would actually conserve from cycle to cycle, which would mean that if the universe did in fact have this expanding and contracting um model, then you would have it would go back to smaller and smaller universes because the entropy would be greater each time, which means even if you have this expansion and contraction, you still have a beginning that begins with a smaller and smaller universe, eventually going down to nothing. So you still have a beginning, you're just pushing it back a step, and that does not answer the problem. It doesn't, in other words, you're not answering the question, you're just pushing the question back a step. It's like if I said to my wife, "Oh, hey, who made tea today?" And she said, "Well, it wasn't me." That wouldn't answer the question. That just means, okay, if it wasn't you, who was it? Like, do I have to guess every member of our household until I get the right one? But it was actually her. She made me tea and it's amazing. So, that's the truth. Why she would say it wasn't her, I don't know. I don't know. That's for her to decide. I can't answer all the questions, you guys. Um, so modern retellings of this expanding and contracting garbage universe model use string theory to bolster their claim. And what's interesting is, so string theory proposes or propounds, I guess, a five-dimensional universe, and then they assert that dark matter first pushes and then changes to pull. And this is based in a model that this is actually based in a weird version of string theory that I guess is different from the standard quark model. I'm gonna be honest with you guys. I'm not I'm not somebody who's studied a lot of string theory, so I will leave this to the experts to discuss. Going to um I'm going to read from page 142 and let our experts explain this theory to you guys. This cyclic scenario is plagued with problems. For one thing, it's inconsistent with the very string theory that it's based on. Nobody has ever been able to solve that problem. Moreover, this is simply the five-dimensional equivalent of a three-dimensional oscillating universe. As such, it faces the same problems that the oscillating model already did. But more interesting is that in 2001, inflation theorist Aaron Guth and two other physicists wrote an article on how inflation is not past eternal. They were able to generalize their results to show that they were also applicable to multidimensional models like the one in the newspaper article. So it turns out that even the cyclical model in 5 dimensions has to have a beginning. And then William Lane Craig sighed and sat back in his chair. It's amazing how this falls into a consistent pattern, he said. Theories designed to avoid the beginning of the universe have either turned out to be untenable, like the steady state theory, or else they actually imply the very beginning of the universe that their proponents have been so desperately trying to avoid. So, once again, we see a common theme. We also see these kinds of self-destructive theories that take us right back to the beginning anyway. It really feels that a lot of people practice science in a way that's hamstrung because they sort of tie their hands behind their back and say, we don't want to accept the theories that contradict our materialistic worldview. So we're going to create a theory to support the materialistic worldview, but then lo and behold, the theory ends up falling apart or still implying things that aren't comfortable with a materialistic worldview anyway. In a lot of ways, this reminds me of panspermia. Panspermia was a doctrine that became famous a few years ago as an attempt to get rid of God. And I remember, excuse me, I remember about, excuse me, my goodness. I think it was like 10 years ago that panspermia was just all the rage. People were constantly talking about panspermia, and movies were being made like Prometheus and just all kinds of things. And I remember it seemed so like odd that all of a sudden this was like the thing that everybody was talking about. But basically, panspermia is an attempt to get rid of God by pushing the question back. It says, well, we weren't created by God, we were created by aliens who seeded the planet. But again, this just pushes the question back. It doesn't answer the question. Like, okay, if you're saying that we were seeded by aliens, where did the aliens come from? And this is the same thing on a larger scale. They these people throw out these theories and then they say, well, see, this makes it so that the universe is eternal. But then it doesn't make it so that the universe is eternal. You're just at most pushing the question back a step. But really, most of the time, it's not even doing that because most of the time, these theories are untenable. But to the extent that they even end up working at all, they just push the question back. And this is why Andre Lind said that this particular theory is popular among journalists, but unpopular among cosmologists. So the oscillating universe theory is one that sort of on the popular level is fun for people who don't like God to speculate about. And it's one that people who don't want to be Christians like to latch on to because they can say, oh, well, they can talk about, oh, well, there's string theory and quark models and all this stuff. And then the theory itself ends up contradicting the very models that they're talking about anyway. So I don't really see the value in that. But this is the thing is people like to latch on to these things, and journalists like to come out with clickbaity articles rather than do actual journalism because actual journalism is kind of boring and requires you to do real work and dig and get hard facts and good information and present that information in a way that is true and relatable to people. And that takes a lot of work. Whereas just coming up with some clickbaity article that most people aren't really going to read, they're just going to read the title and go, checkmate creationists. That's super easy. So, speaking of Lind, though, Lind is not off the hook. Andre Lind came up with a theory called chaotic inflation that he says eliminates the need for a beginning point. So let's see what William Lane Craig has to say about that. Lind speculated that maybe inflation, this rapid expansion of the universe, never really quits. He said maybe the universe expands like a balloon, and when it reaches a certain point, then inflation is spawned off of it and begins to expand, and then something expands off of that. So you have inflation, begetting inflation, and it goes on forever. The obvious question then is, could this inflation be eternal in the past? Could every inflationary domain be the creation of a prior domain so that the universe is eternally inflating and self-reproducing entity. So Lee Strobel asks him, is that possible? And William Lane Craig says, I'm afraid not. As I said earlier, a universe that is eternally inflating towards the future cannot be past eternal. Two prominent physicists demonstrated that as far back as 1994. There has to be a beginning at some point in the infinite past, and in Lind's response, he admitted they were correct. So even Lind himself has admitted that his theory does have a fatal flaw. It's once again just like panspermia and just like the all of the other theories, it just pushes the question back a step. But there's also some other problems here. So let's go into it. Another problem is what he calls the mother universe. Um, it's the I sorry, I this is funny because I have the little stern mommy face over the universe, and I forgot that I made that. Okay. Anyway, so you have the mommy universe, and there's basically two ways that the theory for Mama's Boys can work. Either this is the mommy universe is a giant quantum vacuum, and these universes are popping into existence in the quantum vacuum. But we already talked about quantum vacuums and why that doesn't solve the problem. But we also talked about quantum vacuums and how these are not how these aren't what people think they are, and that this still isn't creation out of nothing. But there's a second problem, which is if in fact the mommy universe was eternal, then universes would have already popped up in every point in the mommy universe, because that's how eternality works. If this is something that you're saying constantly happens, and you have something that is eternally past, so there's an infinite set of past events, then the mommy universe would have already filled up. So that's why I have Geralt here slaying the stern mommy universe, because mo- the mommy universe just can't exist. It doesn't make any sense. So if the mother universe, in our book, it says, so if the mother universe were eternal, eventually the universe would have formed at each point. Think about that. Finally, these universes would be running into each other or coalescing until the entire quantum vacuum in the mother universe would be filled with an infinitely old universe, which contradicts our observations, and that's why the model has not survived. So this model hasn't survived for the same reasons that the other models haven't survived. Now, our next step is I am going to talk about Stephen Hawking. Rest in peace is Stephen Hawking's theory. So Stephen Hawking, back when he wasn't spending time at Epstein's Island, um committing SA against little people, he was envisioning the universe with no exact beginning or end. His mathematical equation for this describes the universe as coming to a loop instead of a point. So I'll let William Lane Craig explain. He says the standard Big Bang theory can be represented by a cone, drawing what looked like an empty sugar cone from Baskin Robbins. The point of the cone represents the beginning of the universe, the singularity where the Big Bang occurred. It's the beginning point, and it has a sharp edge to it. The expansion of the universe as it gets older and grows is represented by the cone's overall expanding shape. This will be familiar from the last two videos of this series, where I actually have that model. You have the cone, and I have put an icon of Jesus Christ. in the cone, at the point of the cone. Um, Anyway, so I nodded that I was tracking with him. Then he took a second sheet of paper. Hawking's model is like a cone too, except it doesn't come to a point. He drew a picture of what resembled a badminton birdie. Instead of coming to a sharp point, the end of the cone is rounded. As you can see, there's no singularity, there's no sharp edge. If you were to start at the mouth of the cone and go backward in time, he said, his pencil tracing along the line of the cone, you would not come back to a beginning point, but instead you would simply follow the curve, and suddenly you would find yourself heading toward forward in time again. This was consistent with the way Hawking's biographers envisioned his theory. They said it would be like walking north until you reached the North Pole, and then suddenly, if you kept walking, you would find yourself heading south. There is no beginning and no end, no boundaries, one writer explained. The universe always was, always is, and always will be. Um, okay. So here's one problem is that this is literally just imaginary. And I mean imaginary numbers. Once you plug real numbers into the equation instead of imaginary numbers, you don't get the curve. You get the same point that every other Big Bang model comes to. So it still is a cone. You're just replacing the cone with the cone numbers with imaginary numbers and getting results that don't exist. And here's the thing about imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers have value in the theoretical realm. But once you want to take your theory and apply it to the real world, you have to replace the imaginary numbers with real numbers. Otherwise, your theory doesn't hold water. So what are imaginary numbers? They are multiples of the square root of -1. In this model, they have the effect of turning into a dimension of space. The problem is that when imaginary numbers are employed, they are merely computational devices used to grease equations and get the result a mathematician wants, which is fine, but when you want to get real physical results, you have to convert imaginary numbers into real numbers. Hawking refuses to convert them, and he just keeps everything in the imaginary realm. Well, here's the problem for Stephen Hawking. Um, Keeping it in the imaginary realm doesn't work because when and there's a reason why Hawking didn't want to use real numbers, because the truth is, once you use real numbers, it ceases to have the curve. Although I'd actually point out that I really don't care. It still comes to a beginning. I don't see how the curve matters. It comes to a beginning. But none of that my observation that it still comes to a curve doesn't matter, because this is just an imaginary theory using imaginary numbers and isn't um isn't actually related to anything in the real world. Now, I find this ironic because on social media, atheists often come on my posts with claims of you worship a sky daddy, you worship an imaginary friend, and all these things. Well, you guys follow a pervert who used imaginary numbers instead of real numbers. So, which one of us is really following something imaginary anyway? But I digress. What's important to understand is how reversed the situation was from, say, 100 years ago. So this is from our book. William Lane Craig is saying this: back then, Christians had to maintain faith in the Bible that despite all appearances to the contrary, the universe was not eternal, but was instead created out of nothing a finite time ago. Now the situation is exactly the opposite. It is the atheist who must maintain by faith, despite all evidence to the contrary, that the universe did not have a beginning a finite time ago, but is in some inexplicable way eternal after all. So the shoe is exactly on the other foot. The Christian can stand confidently within biblical truth knowing it's in line with mainstream astrophysics and cosmology. It is the atheist who feels uncomfortable and marginalized today. So here's the thing: Christianity gives us an informed faith. Atheism requires you to have a blind faith. There's a big difference between informed faith and blind faith. As I've said before, informed faith does not act in spite of the evidence. Informed faith takes in all of the evidence and applies it to the best way it can. Blind faith wants to ignore the evidence because it contradicts their theory, and that's what atheism is all about. Just like when we discussed macroevolution, and I joked about the fact that we are often accused of following the quote unquote God of the gaps, but then we saw that evolution is actually the theory of the gaps because it doesn't appear in the fossil record. So evolutionists are the ones who actually follow a theory of gaps. We follow the God of the facts. Once again, we see this cropping up. We have the God of the facts. Atheists have nothing but theories with endless gaps. But I want you guys to, I don't want you guys to stop there. I want you guys to press forward into what this series is really all about, which is knowing God. So we're stopping for today because we've examined the alternatives to the Big Bang and we found them wanting. So next time we get together, I'm going to be talking about the evidence of the cosmos living on a razor's edge. So we're going to be talking about this idea of the fine tuning of the universe. But in the meantime, I want you guys to remember that it's not all about learning facts. We can have all of the head knowledge in the world, but ultimately, God is a personal God. And He wants you to not just know about Him, but know Him personally. So come to know the God of the facts for yourself. Leave behind the theories of the gaps and come and have a personal relationship with the God of the facts. Come to your local Orthodox church this Sunday and and worship with us. Find out when our inquirers classes, ask your questions and learn, come and see. And come and see for yourself what a relationship with God is and what it's like. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope this has been helpful to you. God bless. Please do share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed.